Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our evening service again. This is our 8th talk in the Exodus series, Lessons from the Desert. And this evening we're going to explore a little more about the law that we were talking about this morning. We've seen as we've journeyed through the book of Exodus that the story so far was that it was a story of the recovery of freedom. And the word Exodus means exit. And it was this idea of God taking his people out from a place of oppression and slavery into a place of freedom. But now in this place of freedom, they're seeking a new identity. And from chapter 18 onwards, we learn about this new identity. Freedom can sometimes be a really scary thing, because when you get freedom, you wonder, what am I going to do with it? Sometimes ex-prisoners, when they come out of jail, because for so long their life has been regulated, they've been told when to get up, when to eat, what to do, and when to do it, that suddenly when they have freedom, it's almost overwhelming because they just don't know what to do. And they're also not sure of who they are in the midst of that new freedom. And so what's happening here in the story of the law is that God is speaking into the freedom that the people have recovered, and he's giving them a new identity. And the law is the basis of this new identity. In chapter 20, the passages that we read, we see that at the heart of the law is the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are basically broken into two. The first section deals with our relationship to God, and there are 4 commandments telling us how we shouldn't make idols and various other things, and how we should keep the Sabbath holy unto him. And then the next 6 relate to our relationship to others. Very interestingly, right at the end, the only one that deals with our inner attitude is you shall not covet. All the others are things that you do externally, but the last one is what happens internally. Don't have an attitude of coveting. Interestingly, Paul in the New Testament, he explains that commandment actually contains all the rest. Because if you can address the inner issues, you'll address the external issues and the way that we choose to live. The story is that this law was given to Moses as he went up onto the mountain, and God appeared to him and the people. And God gave them 2 tablets. And Moses is bringing these 2 tablets to the people. The likelihood is that actually these tablets weren't great big slabs. Maybe you've seen movies or whatever and you see these big slabs. They probably were more iPad size and just small engraved tablets like the ones that we found in the Far East. But people have asked the question, why 2 tablets? It's an interesting question. Why 2 tablets? And some people think it's maybe a pragmatic answer, because all of the commandments could fit on 1 tablet. Because actually, as I say, they weren't these large slabs. And so they required 2 tablets. Other thing, people think it may be to do with these commandments relating to God and commandments relating to others. And the commandments relating to God were on 1 tablet, and the commandments relating to others were on the other. But the most popular with scholars is the idea that this represented 2 copies. Just as in our present age, whenever you make a contract, you usually have 2 copies, and both parties have a copy. So the idea was that there were 2 copies. And so if one got destroyed or one got damaged, there would be another copy available. It means that when Moses comes down, and we'll see next week that when Moses comes down with these 2 tablets and he's horrified at the idolatry the people have got into, and he destroys not just 1 tablet but 2 tablets, it signifies the complete distinguishing or extinguishing of the covenant relationship, and it's total because both the copies are destroyed. And so the idea of the 2 copies may be leading up to the story where actually we see the destruction of the covenant in terms of Moses next week. However, the 10 Commandments aren't the only commandments that we have here. And you'll see if you begin to read into the next following chapters, Exodus 21, 22, 23, and 24, you're going to find a whole bunch of commandments. Can we move to the next slide? And you're going to see commandments dealing with basic case law. So this is what to do in particular instances. And these commandments deal with worship, with slavery, with marriage, with theft, with violence, with dangerous animals, and relationships with your parents. And so we see a whole bunch of various laws presented in this next section. And many of them, as you read them, seem very distant from the world in which we live. In fact, you wonder, why have we got all these laws in the Bible? Because they relate to a culture of almost 4,500 years ago, and they don't relate to our culture. And so how are we to understand these laws? Part of the problem that we have with the law has been generated by this fact that so many of the laws just don't seem to relate to our present day. In fact, you'll maybe see a comedian, and he'll often come and almost in a mocking fashion to mock Christianity or to mock the Old Testament, you just start to read out some of these laws. And people will laugh because they seem absurd to us in our modern day and age. And they just don't understand what the law is doing. And it becomes a basis of ridicule. And so it's really important that we as Christians understand why the law is there and what significance it has. And I want to address 3 misconceptions in relation to the law. The first misconception that I want to talk about is the idea that the law is negative. If you grew up in evangelical Protestantism, where we read the Apostle Paul through the eyes of the reformer Luther, you'll know that the idea of law and grace were set against each other. We kind of saw the law over here, and it was negative, and it was full of rules and oppression and brought people into bondage. And we saw the grace and love of God over here, which was all about freedom and setting people free from the constraints of the things that bound them. And the two were set in opposition to one another. And of course, this led to a very negative view of the law. Yet as we read the Old Testament, and in fact, as we now read the New Testament, we actually see that the giving of the law was not contrary to love and grace, but was an expression of love and grace. One of the things that is happening in Exodus with the giving of the law is that it is a sign of the new identity and relationship that we have with God. In other words, the law is a sign of what we call a covenant. Here we've got a couple being married, and you'll know that traditionally when a couple get married, the wife will take the name of her husband. And the reason she does this is because she's signifying that she has a new identity that is being born out of a relationship. And through being married, she is affirming this new identity. Same thing is happening in Exodus. God is calling the people into a relationship with himself, as we saw this morning. And what he's now doing is he's saying, in terms of this new identity, it is an expression of a relationship that you have. But the mark or the evidence of that identity and relationship is actually seen in terms of the law. It's a wee bit like an engagement ring, you know. When someone gets a diamond-encrusted ring, they want to show it off. They want to go to the office and wave around their hands to say, I'm in a relationship, and look, here's the sign that I'm in a relationship. Nowadays, you take a photo and you stick it on Facebook or Instagram so that everybody knows your relationship status has changed. And so the same thing is happening here with the law. It is an expression of God's love and grace towards the people. And as that love and grace is expressed, it is defined in terms of the law, in terms of a pattern and a distinctive way of living that denotes a relationship. You see, when God gives the people the law, what he's saying is you have to modify and change your behavior to denote this new relationship that you are in with God. I had a friend, and he recently became single, and he started to go on various dating apps. And as he was on some of these dating apps, he began to strike up relationships with various women and begin to communicate with them and things like that. And after a few weeks, I was chatting to him. Initially, he was really excited, but after a few weeks, he didn't seem so excited. And I was saying, what's the problem? And he said, well, the thing is, when I start a relationship with a woman, what I realize is it isn't exclusive. She's writing to 3 or 4 other guys, and she's working out which one is the best one and whether she can get an upgrade on me or not. And sadly, at that stage, most women were getting an upgrade on him. And so he wasn't that happy about it. And he was kind of realizing that, if you come into a relationship with someone, then you have to stop that. It has to become an exclusive thing. It has to become an identified thing where you're saying, I am in relationship with you and you are in relationship with me. And that means our behaviors and patterns have to change. If he gets into a relationship with a woman and she continues to build relationships with other people, there is a problem with the relationship. And it's the same thing here. The law is given as a pattern to reflect a distinctive way of living, to denote a relationship. But it's not a negative thing because it's an expression of God's love and grace. And so all of these rules aren't an oppressive thing, but actually a really positive thing. That's why you'll find in things like Psalm 119, a real celebration of the law, a real rejoicing at the fact that God has given his law to his people. Not a negative thing, but an expression of his love and grace. The second thing misconception is that the law is absurd. And again, we talked about the comedians who love to mock in terms of the Old Testament ordinances. There are, in the book of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, almost 613 of these commands. And many of these commands just seem really remote from us today. You'll find a command like the one in Exodus chapter 20, verse 26, which says, don't wear a skirt in worship so that when you climb up the steps of the sanctuary, people won't be able to see up your skirt. That's what it says. And you kind of think, well, what relevance is that to us today? And as you can see from the way I'm dressed this evening, I amn't wearing a skirt. It's not a big issue for us. And we certainly haven't got steps that we're climbing up. And so what relevance is that to us? Is this even pertinent? In Exodus 23, we have another instance, maybe one that seems even weirder, in verse 19, where we're told that we aren't to cook young goats in its mother's milk. You'll be glad to know there's a commandment that none of us want to break. But the question is, what's that saying? And what's that about? And how does that have any relevance? And it's very easy to poke fun at these laws and see them as completely irrelevant and wonder why God's even put them there, or even see them in some senses as something that discredits Christianity. What we've got to understand when we come to all these other laws, that these are specific applications of the universal principles that we see in terms of the 10 Commandments. What we're seeing is universal ethical principles which span time and culture being applied in specific situations relative to that situation. So for instance, the idea of climbing the steps and not wearing a skirt was actually a prohibition against sexual immorality. What it was warning was saying, make sure that in your worship of God, you don't allow sexual immorality to enter into that worship. Now, you might not have a problem and an issue in terms of skirts, but you may have a problem in terms of allowing immorality to shape your worship in relation to God. So, although it takes a different expression in a 21st century context, it actually still is the application of a universal principle. The idea of cooking goats in milk, we're not entirely sure what it relates to, but a lot of scholars believe it was some Canaanite and pagan practice. And so what it is a reiteration and an application of the idea of don't have other gods beside me. And by doing this, they somehow were engaging in some kind of idolatry or the fringes of idolatry that were denying God his place. Again, we might not do that through cooking young goats, but we do it in other ways. And so what we see is the application of universal ethical principles in specific contexts and situations. Now, here's the thing. It's really important that we understand historical context changes how laws are applied. And if we don't understand that, and we then take laws from the Old Testament and try and apply them in our lives today, they will seem odd or even offensive. But the fundamental practice of taking universal ethical principles and applying them today still holds good. And one of the things we have to be careful of doing is not confusing relative principles and universal precepts. And Christians are often bad at that. Sometimes there is Christians who deny universal precepts. In other words, they begin to question the foundational principles that we see laid down in the Ten Commandments. And they begin to think that we don't have to give God his place. We don't have to have this kind of exclusive worship. We'll begin to question what it means to embody these values and begins to chip away at them and erode them. And yet we also have the other extreme, and it's more common, which is where we take relative ideas and relative ethical principles and we apply them in a wrong context. Some people believed that it was immoral to wear a hat or not wear a hat in church. And if you were a woman, you were to wear a hat, and if you were a man, you weren't to wear a hat. And if you were a woman and you didn't wear a hat, then this was immoral. And this principle applied in all times, in all places, everywhere. And this was the way it was to be. And so people would come to church and they didn't wear hats. This once happened to my wife in the free church in the Isle of Lewis. My wife, daughter, and her friend were the only three women in this church of about 500 people that weren't wearing hats. And the minister specifically quoted the need for women to wear hats, almost pointedly looking at them. And you kind of think, what's going on there? And what's happened is they've taken a relative principle and they've made it absolute. And as Christians, we must make sure we don't do that. Because if we do that, then the law does become an oppressive thing. However, we must still affirm the idea of the law, but understand its application in a specific historical context. So the balance is don't lose the principles, but don't turn relatives into absolutes. Thirdly, then, we have to understand that the law is not the basis of our salvation. And sometimes people, again, have this misconception that law is the basis of our salvation. And they think that Christianity is all about rule keeping. And if you keep the rules, then you can be a Christian. You'll sometimes hear this in a work context where somebody will say, well, Christians can't smoke, they can't drink, they can't swear, and if you do these things, you can't be a Christian. But we have to remind ourselves that actually that's a misconception of the law. And the New Testament is very clear about this. We are not saved by the law, but the law is an expression of God's deliverance towards us. If you look at the prologue here in chapter 20, it says, and God spoke all these words. He said in verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. What is happening here is God is explaining, you have become a people not by obeying my laws, not by all these regulations and meticulously keeping them, but you have become a people by me choosing you and delivering you. And that's the basis of your salvation, the basis of your deliverance, my action toward you. However, in gratitude in relation to God's saving act, I call upon you to live as a distinctive people, to live in this way. Again, if we go back to that relationship idea, God has called us into relationship with himself, and he's saying, now you're in relationship, I want you to be faithful to me and express that relationship by living according to these laws. Again, in the New Testament, we see a critique of Judaism where the critique that people like Paul launch is saying, you've lost sight of the purpose of the law. What you've done is you've turned the law into the basis of your salvation. And you think that if you don't smoke or you don't drink or you don't swear, that somehow you were saved. But Paul says, no, that's not the basis of salvation. The basis of salvation is what Jesus has done on the cross in his death and resurrection. And that is the only basis of your salvation. But because Christ has died for you and you now know his grace and love, Paul also wanted to then affirm and say that we are called to live a holy life that reflects that relationship with him. The law doesn't become irrelevant in the New Testament. Paul also identifies the fact that people had sort of started to see the law as externally imposed. And so the way the law worked was, the idea was that you could impose the law on people and that they would have to be good and they would have to behave. And if they obeyed the external laws, then somehow they were saved. Remember Jesus talking to the Pharisees? He said, you guys meticulously adhere to all these regulations, all these weird laws, and you meticulously apply them. And he says, but the fact is you're missing the point of the law. The law is not about meticulous adherence to these principles in order to gain salvation or God's acceptance. But actually, the law is designed as an expression of our gratitude and love towards who our God is. And so our keeping of the law comes out of our hearts, not by it being externally imposed upon us. And therefore, the real problem, and again, the Apostle Paul explains this, is that we need to see a change in our hearts so we want to keep the law. It has to work not from the outside in, but from the inside out. And so the law in the New Testament is not to be some kind of heavy thing that is imposed on us, but something that we say, God, we want to live and embody these things. We want to live in the right way. We want to have right relationships. We want to be in a right relationship with you, God, and we want to be in a right relationship with others. Not because this is being imposed upon us, but because we understand what you've done and how great your grace and love towards us is. And so in response, in gratitude, we want to live in the right way. Is the law irrelevant to today? It's not irrelevant, but it's fulfilled in a way that it's not imposed upon us, but it's born out of our love and desire for God. The law has a place. The law is an expression of God's grace and love towards us. The law is not absurd and irrelevant, and it still exists as a universal principle. And the law is still an expression of the wonderful saving work of Christ. As we acknowledge that work, and hearts that are full of God's Spirit, hearts that are full of his love and gratitude, we live out and embody a right relationship to God and a right relationship to each other. Amen. Let's pray. Lord God, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for the place of the law. Lord, help us to understand its significance. Help us not to see the law as something that is imposed upon us. Help us not to see the law as a bunch of rules that restricts our freedom. But help us to understand that it is the overflow of a grateful heart as we acknowledge your saving acts towards us. Lord, help us to live in a right way towards you and in a right way towards others. We ask this in your name. Amen.